Well, thank you. I'm incredibly honored to be here today, and I have to admit, I'm following a very interesting talk, and I have nothing to say about the microbiome. So what I'm going to do is tell you a story about the importance of introducing new actors into conventional history. And I will show how the narrative shifts when other actors, such as women, nurses, are introduced as well as complicated. The title serves as a place for launching a critique of the medical civil rights narrative of the 1960s, which typically focuses primarily on men and physicians such as Jack Geiger and the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which was an activist medical organization based in New York City and founded in early 1960s. I'll first briefly set the context in Milestone, Mississippi in 64 and 65, as location is really a critical part of the story. I'll then deconstruct the idea of going and then the idea of we. Now, I'm not addressing the universe of nurses who went south in the mid-60s. There were many nurses of all races, and all experienced violence and discrimination, but not on the same scale as the black nurses in the South. There we go. A nurse was killed when she was stopped with a black activist in her car. Nurses were imprisoned. They worked for many activist groups, including the Medical Committee, SNCC, CORE, and the Dental Ministry, to name a few. They bore witness to beatings and tortures when activists were in prison. They marched with Martin Luther King, and they took care of Congressman John Lewis when he was terribly beaten on Bloody Sunday. But we don't really know a lot about the nurses, how they became activists, their everyday work in the communities, and how their activism really confounds the traditional narrative of medical civil rights. Now, the title of this talk, We Went to Mississippi, comes from an article in the American Journal of Nursing authored by 3 nurses, Helene Richardson Sanders, Patricia Weatherly, and M. Phyllis Cunningham. Richardson Sanders and Weatherly worked in the community health clinic in Milestone, Mississippi, Holmes County, and Cunningham met them as she traveled across the South as a field officer for SNCC and the Medical Committee for Human Rights. A second white nurse, Josephine De Sparty, also worked in Milestone, and she's featured in the article. Now, Mississippi was the focus of the Summer of '64 campaign, and it was considered the worst of the worst places in the South. In 1960, Mississippi had 59 black doctors, 370-some black nurses, and only a handful of dentists for roughly 1 million black citizens, which was half of the state's population. Most white physicians, pharmacists, institutions refused to serve black citizens. The state's infant and maternal mortality and morbidity was the worst in the state, in the nation, and higher than in most parts of the world. At this time, Holmes County was the site of the clinic, and it was one of the poorest in the state. In a 1965 Head Start program report, the examiners noted all of the children needed dental attention, 50% of the children needed attention for tonsillitis, several had enlarged and tender livers. Large umbilical hernias were present in many children, and 50% of the kids had pot bellies from malnutrition and intestinal parasites. Milestone, Mississippi, where 3 of the 4 nurses worked and lived from 1964 to '66, was an unincorporated community in Holmes County. There were still several plantations in the surrounding areas that hired workers to pick cotton. They lived in the plantation owners' shacks for exorbitant rent, while plantation owners controlled their lives, what doctors they went to see, and which stores they could patronize. Even before 1964, Milestone was a hotbed of civil rights activities as community residents actively sought the right to vote, to gain access to health care and better schools. Strong leaders like Hartman Turnbow, Ozell Mitchell, and Alma Marie Carnegie were effective community organizers and well known to SNCC and CORE leaders. Most of the community owned guns, not only for hunting, but for protection from vigilante night riders. SNCC volunteers helped build a community center in Milestone where people could gather for organizing meetings, learn to read, and how to apply for the new Medicaid and Medicare programs. The health center opened as part of the community center in 1965, but before that, the nurses and the aides they recruited conducted classes on health promotion, worked in the kindergarten, and provided family planning education. Now, the nurses did more than just go to Mississippi, and perhaps more important, they stayed for at least a year. They were not just the summer as many volunteers did in 1964. They weren't there as tourists, and they were not the weekend warriors, the doctors, the nurses, and others who came south for a week or two, or perhaps over their Christmas break, which Cunningham later called the visiting fireman approach. She noted, quote, pompous liberal doctors and nurses could think highly of themselves by daring a 2-week voyeuristic trip to the wilds of Mississippi and then go back home and without batting an eye continue their lucrative and oft-times racist practices. The nurses' journeys to Mississippi were all different. Richardson Sanders came as a medical committee volunteer and returned to the Chicago area in 1965, where she still manages a family landscaping business in South Chicago. Weatherly was also a medical committee volunteer, and she left in 1966. She married and moved to New Jersey, but she died at a young age after the birth of twins. Cunningham first volunteered with SNCC in mid-1964 and stayed south until 1966 when the SNCC leadership voted to limit membership to blacks, which she supported. She reports that after the voting, Stokely Carmichael said to her, "I didn't mean you." She started the organization Grannies for Peace, which stages weekly protests in New York City. Now, De Sparty came south as a Corps volunteer and stayed for a year. She later worked with physician Jack Geiger, first at Tufts University Columbia Point Clinic, and then at the Mount Bayou Clinic in Mississippi, where she helped develop that center, but is not acknowledged. Now, why the nurses went and the meaning of their going was different for each. The black nurses, Sanderson, Richardson, and Weatherly, may have situated their activism through personal experiences with racism and injustice. Activism was part of their everyday struggle for themselves, their families, and their communities, something they did as a way to survive, although it was different for each of them. For them, activism and nursing intersected. For Richardson, going to Mississippi may have signified going home, a return to her community rather than a new experience or an adventure. She didn't have a choice. She did have a choice, but it was different than the choices available to Cunningham and De Sparty. Richardson Sanders was from Belzoni, Mississippi. Located just below Holmes County and Humphreys County, Belzoni still had several cotton plantations in 1960, and Richardson Sanders was from a sharecropper family. Belzoni had a very violent racial history and was the site of the never-prosecuted murder of the Reverend George W. Lee in 1955, who was an early voting rights activist in the town. Through her community, church, or social groups, she would have known that Lee and the others in the town were active in founding the NAACP in Belzoni and attempting to register black voters. She would have been familiar with and experienced the racial discrimination every day in the schools, stores, and health facilities of the area. She would have felt and perhaps witnessed the pervading undercurrent of violence and sexual harassment, while also experiencing the closeness of her community. Richardson Sanders traveled north to train as a nurse shortly before Lee's murder, probably in 1953 or 54, at the Homer G. Phillips Hospital, a prestigious black hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. She later moved to Chicago and was perhaps drawn up in the outreach that the medical committee attempted to do in early 1965 with black schools and nursing, as well as her activities in her church. Now, Geneva Patricia Weatherly, we don't know much about her, but she came from Anderson, Madison County, Indiana, one of the most dangerous and segregated counties in the Midwest. For example, there are no listings in Madison County in the 1954 Negro Travelers Green Book that steered black travelers to safe havens. Areas surrounding Anderson were considered sundown towns, and the Klan had a large presence in the county itself. Her parents were from Alabama and Louisiana and came north when they were young. She grew up middle class in a segregated area of Anderson in an activist family. Her grandfather was the first black policeman in Anderson, and her father followed him and was later active in the Anderson NAACP. Her education was at Holy Cross College in South Bend, Indiana, and she later served as a head nurse at Memorial, which was later Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, in New York City for 3 years, where she may have been active in the medical committee, nursing committee. Weatherly would have known and experienced the racial climate in the North, although it is unclear how prepared she was for the conditions in the South. For De Sparty and Cunningham, activism sprang from their formative experiences in the North rather than a shared cultural or racial experience. They were witness to racial discrimination, and it shaped their sense of moral rights and their choices to do something of value in the world. This was a legitimate reason for going south, but it was tempered by their white privilege, which allowed them this choice and perhaps to have a sense of adventure. Josephine De Sparty grew up in a large, poor Italian immigrant family in Niagara, New York. She went to Niagara University and then worked for the Niagara Health Department. Her work took her to the housing projects and the black neighborhoods where she found, quote, they were struggling people just like everyone else, end quote. She moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1962 and then worked as a public health nurse in the poor white section of Lake Whitmore. And she joined a strong local core chapter. She also remembered images on television of the Freedom Riders, the sit-ins, the violence as instrumental. She noted, joining was just automatic for me. I was single and I knew the problems because I had seen the conditions in places I had been working. Now, Cunningham came from a very small, lower middle class rural town, Winona, Minnesota. She describes her family as very much a social justice family. She went to the Liberal College of St. Teresa in Winona and was active in the Young Catholic Students Organization. She moved to Chicago in 1961 as a YCS worker in the black community. Her roommate was engaged to Timothy Jenkins, one of the early SNCC organizers, who's credited with moving the organization towards freedom schools and the idea of the protest vote. Through him, she got a first-hand description of SNCC activities in the South, and she joined. Now, Cunningham and De Sparty did not volunteer as nurses, but as activists to increase voter registration and to bear witness to the violence meted upon workers and activists. But Cunningham noted, as soon as they found out I was a nurse, they were always coming to me with health problems, including bleeding ulcers from stress and lacerations from police brutality. The nurses visited and filed numerous reports on the local hospitals who received federal funds, and this would have included most of them in the South, but continued rampant segregation and disproportionate fees for services. Nurses were helping to build support for federal intervention after the Supreme Court ruling in 1964 in the Simpkins versus Walter G. Coe Memorial Hospital case that struck down the separate but equal clause of Hill-Burton. To continue unpacking the title, I'll turn to the royal we, as in we went. In this article, the V represents nurses who went south, but it does not include the black nurses who were already there, who could not and perhaps did not want to leave, to the black public health nurses who provided critical data on resources and the health status in the region, who traveled the counties with very few resources and very little protection, the midwives working under incredible constraints and circumstances. These examples include civil rights activist Ethel Fagan Mason, the first black nurse to work on the white side of Grady Hospital, and Brigadier General Clara Adams Ender, one of the first students to participate in the Woolworth sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. Their activism was local, personal, and political, and there is little written about them as black women and as nurses. It does not include the women of the community who cared for their families and friends and taught the white nurses about folk remedies and how to create the equipment they needed to splint wounds or pack wounds. We actually don't know very much about the nurses who went to Mississippi. Their silences in the civil rights narrative means we haven't looked close enough, perhaps because of their class, their gender, their race, or their profession. We do have some details of Cunningham and De Sparty through their oral histories and inclusions in texts, but most of this information does not dive deep, and it is representative of how choices are made and whose stories are told. Richardson Sanders and Weatherly only appear in this article and only very briefly in Ditmar's book on the good doctors. Their backgrounds had to be ferreted out, and there are still many gaps and holes, even as they worked with sharecroppers, domestic workers, teachers, beauticians, and other nurses on the ground. A Health Pack article about the medical committee, who was the employer of these nurses, noted, "The medical committee lost sight of the fact that much of the day-to-day nitty-gritty work down south was being done not by the doctors, but by the nurses, who barely had access to the wings of the stage, let alone the footlights." Cunningham related how one medical committee physician referred to their activities as, quote, "the grand work being done by our little maids in the South," end quote. So how did the white nurses get their work done? And how did they develop trustworthiness to serve the Milestone community? When there was a long, you can see Robert Kennedy has not established trustworthiness here. There was long-standing historical reasons for community distrust of whites and white nurses. Nurses participated in segregation and excluded people from waiting rooms and protested integration. There was also the belief by the community that they might be used for experiments if they went to white facilities. So what was really in those vitamins the nurse was handing out? Could the nurses really establish trustworthiness in the face of a long history of racism and collective memory formed through the handing down of stories of bad treatment at the hands of white nurses and doctors? There is also the shadow of involuntary sterilization, the Mississippi appendectomy, which was commonplace and actually increased in Mississippi between 1960 and 1965. It's very difficult to pull this out. And this photograph can be unpacked. The community allowed white nurses to stay in their homes, perhaps as a sign. The community did need health services, and nurses were a way of getting what they needed. And the white community was not hospitable, seeing the nurses as outside agitators. But offering housing could have been a way of protecting the community, as they could monitor the nurses and help them navigate dangerous territory. If a white nurse was injured or killed, the authorities would have used this as an excuse to bring pressure and violence to the community. The white nurses themselves were caught in this bind, whereas the black nurses would have had no choice. Richardson Sanders had to develop a different level of trustworthiness. She was black and from the area, although she had been up north for a while. She was able to initiate formal structures at the health center that De Sparty could not. For example, initially people would make appointments and not keep them. At white institutions, they may only have been seen if all the white people were attended to. The community saw the appointment as a flexible concept, a privilege that only white people had. Sanders and Richardson proved trustworthy to the community and ensured they would receive services at particular times. And tellingly, the clinic closed after the nurses left. Neither Cunningham nor De Sparty had an intimate historical understanding of the experience or reference of the scope and extent of the everyday violence, insults, and threats to the community that the community faced, and were emotionally shaken by the conditions they found in the towns, on the plantations, and in the hospitals, and perhaps by the inability to develop trustworthiness. In July 1965, De Sparty noted, "She might have been more depressed than the situation indicated," and wrote, "I'm afraid I cannot stay much longer in Holmes County. When I can leave, I will." In August, she wrote, "Somewhere along the line, the balance has shifted from not being able to quit the struggle to not being able to stay in it." So what does this narrative tell us? To steal a phrase from historian Joan Scott, like gender, nursing is a useful category of analysis, but one that is not fixed and carries many meanings. Through this narrative, I argue that nursing as a subject matter and as an analytic tool offers a way to broaden our perception of the medical civil rights movement, as well as who is a nurse. Riffing more on Scott, writing nurses into history would not only add new subject matter, but force a critical re-examination of the premises and standards of existing work. Doing this involves more than adding nurses and stirring. It involves redefining and enlarging traditional notions of historical significance and meaning to encompass personal experiences as well as public and political activities. Their inclusion has to be more than our acknowledgement that nurses participated or went there. To borrow from Brian Stevenson yesterday, they were proximate. They saw injustices every day and provided the voice to the narratives underneath to illustrate what we don't know or what we don't want to acknowledge. They also redefined the meaning of activism through their work as nurses, as well as the meaning of providing care that shapes the perception of our health today. Thanks.
Michael Silverstein, Chicago. I was wondering, under what auspices were the nurses present in Holmes County? Was it all a single kind of, as we say in today's vernacular, NGO, or were they religious organizations, or how did they get there?
Well, in different ways. So Sanders and Richardson and Weatherly came as employees of the Medical Committee for Human Rights. De Sparty came as a corps volunteer and sort of has a funny story of she owned a Volkswagen Bug, and she drove it down from Michigan. And she said that was probably the first stupid thing I did because, number one, it was a foreign car going to Mississippi. But they all came under the auspices of all the different organizations that were working there at the time.
Yes, Pat, here. Oh.
The balcony?
Yes.
Dale Dean from Vienna, Virginia. This is a very interesting story, and obviously seems to be not one that's well known. Could you talk a little bit more about the sources that you use to uncover it and where research might take you further? Thank you.
Sure. So a lot of the records are from the Medical Committee for Human Rights archives that are in the Kislak Library at the University of Pennsylvania. I've also interviewed both Cunningham and De Sparty. I have reached out to Helene Richardson Sanders, and we're setting up some time to talk. There's no record of any oral history of her. There's many records of De Sparty and Cunningham, although they've told me different things, and I think they've told others. There are a great deal of records at Tuskegee that I'd like to take a look at, also down in Nashville at Meharry. Lots and lots of places where I plan to go to fill out the story. Atlanta has a great, at Emory, there's a great archive on the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I'm very interested. It's interesting. So I got interested in this because I wanted to look at health as a civil right. And when I started looking, I read John Dittmer's book, The Good Doctors, and then, when I went into the records, I kept finding the nurses. they kept coming in. You know, they're writing reports, they're going out in the country, they're doing all these things. And I thought, you know, why is it we don't know about them? And what were they doing? So.
Yes.
Pat Graham, Cambridge, Mass. My question was partly the last question, but even more, you have a very busy life. You've done lots of interesting things. What got you going to ask these kinds of questions, to investigate this very important issue?
Interesting question. So I'm a historian of nursing and healthcare, and I had been looking at both. I started looking at gender and technology. I then moved to what was happening outside of institutions where there's less formal structures. And when I was looking at the nurse practitioner movement, I came upon all of these very interesting health centers that started forming in 64, 65, and continued into still continue today. I found a clinic that the Black Panthers started. They had 23 across the country at one point. And so thinking about that, I was thinking, how is it that this idea of health rights and civil rights are beginning to come together, to be engaged? And so that's how I moved onward into these questions. So.
Thank you so much. I think I'm being told that it's time for a break. Is that right? I've lost Annie. Thank you. But thank you so much. Thank you. It's really wonderful.